In this video, we're going to discuss some of the potential locations of where life began on Earth. And to be honest, we don't really have, scientists don't really have the answers to all of these questions. We have ideas and some data that helps us kind of make some explanations of where we think life maybe began on the planet, but we don't have all the answers. And unfortunately, we may not ever have all the answers, but we do have a good amount of data that suggests maybe some different locations or ideas of where that origin might have come from. And so in this video, we're going to take a look at that, and this is IBD1. So where might life have come from? One of the ideas is that comets may have actually delivered organic compounds to Earth. And comets have been found to actually contain a variety of organic compounds. And we believe there's a period of heavy bombardment of the Earth, of different comets, about 4 million years ago, which may have actually delivered the first organic compounds and potentially also molecules to make water. The process or the presence of living cells, we know that cells can be prokaryotes, eukaryotes, and have lots of different components to them. These cells actually might have been preceded by some protobionts with internal chemical environments, basically different from their surroundings. So not complete cells, but systems basically that have an internal environment that's very different from their overall surroundings. Some examples here of this. We've done, a variety of people have done a number of different experiments to try to see if it would be possible to produce organic compounds from non-organic molecules. And in the 1920s, two individuals, Oprin and Haldane, basically thought that the early atmosphere was thought to be a reducing atmosphere. And some later simulations done by Mueller and Urey, other individuals in the 50s, basically they conducted some experiments to try to simulate what they thought would be conditions present on Earth before the development of oxygen in the atmosphere and before the development of life, basically to simulate conditions that maybe could have resulted in the production of organic molecules, specifically amino acids. And so they took what they thought were these conditions based off of different soil samples and different rock core samples and different ice samples, basically to create a mock or model environment of what they thought would be present at the time, to see if it would be possible to make organic molecules. And so they used water, methane, ammonia, hydrogen, and sealed it basically inside of a sterile tubes and flask. They heated up that water to produce vapor, provided some sparks to simulate lightning, cooled the atmosphere, and within a couple of weeks they were actually able to produce some organic compounds as well as some amino acids. Other more recent experiments have also created amino acids, and we've looked at some of these as well in class. Now, there's some thoughts that maybe that the conditions that they've hypothesized were present on the early Earth were not exactly the same. What they used in their experiment maybe not exactly the same as what was present at the early Earth, but their experiments really helped us to see that it could potentially be possible to produce organic compounds from these non-organic molecules. One potential location on Earth, actually, where these different conditions, extremely hot, lots of high pressure, these different non-organic molecules like methane, ammonia, could actually be present on Earth is deep sea vents. It's definitely a possibility. For a quick diagram of what their experiment was set up as, you have kind of an apparatus here that's basically a closed environment. So by adding these gas, water vapor, providing a spark, they collected amino acids in this location here. Remove some of these. The abiotic synthesis of organic molecules, basically through this experiment, was found to be possible under conditions that are thought to have existed in early Earth. And so maybe the conditions were slightly different, and more experiments have been done and probably will be continuing to be done to try to simulate this, but it helps to give us an idea of what could be possible in forming molecules, organic molecules, through abiotic synthesis. The process of actually producing an oxygen-rich environment was not very fast. In the early atmosphere, there was a complete lack of oxygen, really. And so you think about modern-day species, both plants and animals, and most of the living organisms on Earth would not have been able to survive because there's no oxygen present. And so the lack of oxygen actually began through the evolution of chlorophyll in prokaryotes that were able to photosynthesize, and this happened about after the emergence of life, about 1.5 to 2 billion years after the emergence of life. This production of oxygen originated in seas and lakes, most likely, and eventually kind of gassed out, or so much oxygen had been produced that it kind of bubbled out or gassed out into the atmosphere. And so as this process continued and more prokaryotes that were photosynthesizing were present, the oxygen levels continued to increase. How do we know this? Well, that's a good question. How do we know that this is actually happening? The presence of oxygen actually can cause the rusting of iron in rocks. And so by looking at the fossil record in the rock layers, as we've done for other examples in our evolution units, we can see where different layers have iron that's rusted, and we can see this in the rock layer. And through using different radioactive dating methods, we can determine about how old these rock layers are. And so here's a picture of a rock layer with some rusted iron in it. And so we can have an idea of when this actually occurred, which is pretty cool. And so we can determine when oxygen began to be present in measurable amounts on Earth. After the oxygen was present, it did increase relatively rapidly from about 1 to 10% of the present levels. Unfortunately, as a result of this, or maybe fortunately for us, this process eliminated most of the anaerobic life on the planet. So life that didn't use oxygen or didn't need oxygen was greatly reduced, but it did provide the opportunity for aerobic life. Some anaerobic life still does remain on the planet. Deep sea volcano vents, again, being a good example of where some organisms can thrive and survive without or in the absence of oxygen. We're going to take a look at the process needed for spontaneous life. In order for organic molecules to be produced from abiotic molecules, how can this happen? And so there's a couple different steps that are necessary for this. The first being non-living abiotic synthesis of synthetic organic molecules. That would be the first step. So here would be a non-living abiotic molecule, nitrogen, some carbon, and some hydrogen. Secondly would be the assembly of those organic molecules into polymers. A polymer being multiple organic molecules put together. And so here we've taken, in the diagram here, we've got multiple monomers put together to make a polymer. Thirdly, the origin of self-replicating molecules, basically allowing for inheritance. We're going to talk about this a little bit more when we discuss RNA here in a second. And lastly, the packaging of these molecules into basically a membrane so that the internal chemistry and environment of these molecules is different from their surroundings. And this is really, really important in order for these molecules and eventually organisms to be able to maintain homeostasis, because the internal environment of these organisms has to be able to be controlled or different generally from the external environment. So here's an image kind of describing or potentially looking at internal environment of a potentially early protobiont cell. So RNA is believed and has been shown through experiments to have evolved before the presence of DNA. DNA is much more stable than RNA, partially because it's a double helix. And through experiments, we've basically deduced that RNA was present before DNA on Earth. Basically, for something to be alive, it needs the ability to store and transmit information, some sort of genotype, and have the ability to express that information as a phenotype. What's really interesting and actually really cool is that RNA can store and transmit and replicate genetic information. And it can actually catalyze activities we found. It was thought for a long time that only enzymes could catalyze the reactions necessary for cell survival, and that enzymes were produced by DNA. And so basically RNA couldn't have preceded DNA and couldn't have allowed for the survival. In the 1980s, two individuals, Sidney Altman and Thomas Cech, found that RNA can also actually catalyze chemical reactions, and they called these riboenzymes. So that these RNA molecules could catalyze reactions as well as store that genetic information. So they were able to have both a genotype and have an expressed phenotype. And from their work, these two individuals actually won the Nobel Prize. And really what this suggested and why it was important is that riboenzymes can catalyze a reaction. And it's caused by the expression of nucleotides in the instructions. And these experiments that these two individuals carried out demonstrated that different variants of RNA can undergo natural selection because they have a genotype and they express that genotype in terms of a phenotype through replication and inheritance and variation. Natural selection can act on these. And so this kind of supports the hypothesis that RNA was used to store genetic information before the evolution of DNA. DNA probably evolved because of RNA's instability, and the hypothesis further supported the fact that RNA makes up ribosomes. Ribosomes are actually made up by RNA and some proteins, a good deal of RNA, which actually go on to make enzymes and help to catalyze reactions. So RNA is definitely probably one of the primary origins of life. One of the last topics that we want to take a look at is the synthesis of organic compounds and where these organic compounds could potentially come from. And we kind of briefly touched on these at the beginning of this video, but one of them would be deep sea hydrothermal vents. And in these vents, the presence or necessary molecules, specifically ammonia and methane, extremely high temperatures and pressures, and temperature may make the synthesis of these organic molecules possible. This is all going back to the big question of where did these RNA molecules come from. We kind of have figured out that basically these RNA molecules came first, but where do they come from? And that's kind of basically what we're looking at here, is where potentially could these organic molecules that eventually produced RNA, where could they have originated from? Although we don't entirely know exactly, this kind of helps give us an overall good idea, and one of these being potential sources being the deep sea hydrothermal vents. The second of these could be volcanoes. This is a potential. In my opinion, I'm not sure that it's quite as strong of a hypothesis, but volcanoes erupting definitely releases methane, ammonia, hydrogen gas, water vapor, a lot of these components necessary to produce the organic compounds. Combining that with lightning, kind of like what Miller and Urey did in their experiments, could actually produce the necessary components to produce these organic molecules. The last one, which actually we saw pretty recently on our planet, was extraterrestrial locations. And I don't mean like aliens appearing and bringing organic molecules to Earth. Would be in the form of comets, like the one that most recently hit in Russia. In September 28 of 1969, a meteor crashed in Australia, and it was actually scientists quickly removed samples from it, and they actually found that organic molecules were deep within the interior of the meteor. And so if this happened in the basically the 70s and late 60s, it's most definitely possible that this could have happened millions of years ago, billions of years ago, and provided the presence of organic molecules, the first organic molecules on Earth. Our last topic for this video is looking at endosymbiotic theory of eukaryotes. Eukaryotes being more complex, generally thought of as more complex cells because they have organelles and they have DNA, and DNA contained within a nucleus, and they are generally a little bit larger and carry out more functions. Well, the idea behind how these eukaryotic cells developed is basically through endosymbiosis, where endo meaning inside and symbiotic being a relationship between two different organisms. And so in this image here, we see we have an ancestral prokaryotic cell, and potentially some infolding of the membranes could have resulted in something that would be comparable to modern day endoplasmic reticulum, potentially a nucleus. The question then comes, well, where do we get all of these different organelles, most specifically mitochondria, chloroplasts, things of those natures? Well, what's really interesting is that both mitochondria and chloroplasts contain their own DNA. And when the cell replicates, those organelles actually replicate their own DNA and replicate themselves in order to prepare for the cell to divide. And so the idea is that maybe some specific cells kind of engulfed, or through phagocytosis brought in these different smaller cells, which are now organelles, and through a kind of mutually beneficial relationship suggested that they held these smaller organelles, and that through this mutual relationship, they've eventually evolved into becoming what we see now today as modern-day eukaryotic cells. So that's it for this video. We'll continue our discussion of development of life in future videos.